we will continue, and so I'm absolutely delighted to re-invite Andrea to stimulate us further. Thank you.
Hi. So I hope you all had a very nice lunch. I surely did, so thank you so much for providing us with the lunch. So I will continue. I will talk a bit about pearls, about ICCS, and about our other studies. Can you hear? Yeah? Okay. Oh, it is not up yet. It's almost up. Yeah, there it is. Great. So I will actually start with a quote from one of the authors that wrote a book about pearls, saying, "A good understanding of written text is an essential skill in the literate society we live in. Well-developed reading comprehension skills are not only required for learning and acquiring new knowledge, but is also required for day-to-day activities." So pearls is actually my favorite, so I started a long time ago as the NRC for pearls for the Netherlands. So I'm still most excited about pearls. I think pearls is the basis for everything. So what is pearls actually? So countries receive high-quality international comparative data of how well fourth grade students can read. So in comparison to TIMSS, pearls is only for the fourth grade, so not for the 8th grade. So it is recognized as a global standard for assessing trends in reading achievement at primary school. Around 400,000 students, 20,000 teachers, and 13,000 schools participated in pearls, and it has now 25 years of trend, it's even more, in 2026. Okay. So this is our definition of reading literacy. I will just let you read this. So pearls is actually administered at a key stage in a key transition stage in children's reading development, because it's at the crucial stage when children are transitioning from learning to read to reading to learn in the fourth grade. Assessing performance at the primary level also means that there is actually still a chance to address any issues for the same children before they leave education. I think you all read this, right? Can go continue. So this is our pearls framework, so what we are actually assessing. And pearls focuses on 3 aspects of student reading literacy: the purposes for reading, the processes of comprehension, and the reading behaviors and attitudes. So reading comprehension requires a broad set of skills and a certain level of prior knowledge on the part of the reader. And in addition, the present definition that you just read also reflects these 3 overarching aspects for reading. As you can see, the purposes for reading are actually in the text, as the passages we call them. The processes for comprehension are the questions we ask after the text. And then the reading behaviors and attitudes are measured with our questionnaires. So here you can see the 4 processes of comprehension within each of the 2 purposes for reading. So the first one is to focus on and retrieve explicitly stated information. That's the easiest one. And then that continues until to evaluate and critique content and contextual elements. So we use these 4 processes of comprehension to gain more insight in how readers actually understand a written text. And they also provide teachers and policymakers with information on how well students are able to carry out these 4 processes in order to understand the written text and how they entertain certain readers. So if they are better in literary experience or if they are better in new information, for instance, so they acquire and use information text. So like with TIMSS, we have our pearls instruments. So we have, for the 4th grade students, the student questionnaire, we have a teacher questionnaire, a principal questionnaire, and the home questionnaire for the parents. And we also have a national questionnaire that ends up in an encyclopedia. So it's really somewhat of the same setup that we just learned about TIMSS. And here are some examples from the student questionnaire from 2016, which shows that Pearls is not only a reading literacy assessment, but also collects really rich context data, how they feel about reading, what their attitudes are. This is the Pearls Encyclopedia. So the new one from 2021 is actually already out. You can access that in our, on our website or on the Boston College website. That's also fine. And Katie will actually put in the link in the presentation so that you can click on the links here also. And this gives information about what happened in the different schools or in the different countries throughout the pandemic. So again, the same as Tim's, Pearls is going digital. And so we started with that already in the 2016 cycle. And that is now being extended on. And the new cycle of 2026 will actually be fully digital. So this is quite a new experience for us, but something that we really, really like. Because we have now incorporated both Pearls and e-Pearls. So Pearls before was actually paper, reading a text, answering the questions after the text. And then we created e-Pearls, which, as you can see, e-Pearls is designed to monitor how well students read, interpret, and critique online information in an environment that looks and feels like the internet. And before, in the very first cycle that we did e-Pearls, we saw it as two separate models. That means that students or that countries could either do only Pearls or do also e-Pearls. But then the world changed. And now we see it that this is something that every student actually comes across. So that is actually part of the Pearls assessment now. That means that some of the passages in this whole assessment are e-Pearls passages, so are this website-like environment, which is really interesting. I can show you an example of it. It's not yet moving. I will make it move. But I will first tell you. So this little purple guy is called Mr. Webster, and he's our avatar. And he's the professor that actually helps you through the website. Because like a normal website, it isn't linear reading, right? Linear reading, like in a Pearls text, you can start at the beginning and you end somewhere and then you get a question. But a website actually has different links and has different tabs and has all these things you can click on, which means in an assessment, if a student clicks on the wrong tab, you need to have somebody to tell you, yeah, that was great, good try, but maybe go to this tab, because otherwise you can't continue in the text. And that's what actually Mr. Webster does. So Mr. Webster asks you about questions. I can't read it very well over there, but I know, I think. And you can then go through the second one. And you see that you have to scroll also, right? That's different than in a literary text. And then if you mess up a bit, if you go in the wrong direction, Mr. Webster says, maybe go here and find the answer. And of course, if you need more help to find the answer, you don't get exactly the same points as when you don't need help, right? So it's and sometimes you don't get an answer at all from a student, and then you still need to be able to go to the next question. Yeah, I think you have a understanding of what is happening here. So these are our e-Pearls questions, or e-Pearls tasks, I have to say, with the different questions. And developing these takes a lot of time. It's even much harder than making a paper and pencil one. And actually the one before this, so Mr. Webster just does the whole assessment, I think, which is great. So I just want to tell you an anecdote about this Mars one, the second one on the screen, the lower one. Because that is actually one that you can find on the Boston College website, and you can explore there more if you are interested about how this e-Pearls looks like. So we created this one, and we were really, really happy with it, and it worked, and we wanted to keep it, so we didn't release it. And then the future happened. So one of the questions in the Mars rover exploration is actually, will the Mars rover find water? And then a year later, it found water. So then you can't use the assessment anymore, right? How you have to actually adjust it. So future happened, which is fine. Then we just make a new one. Okay, so similar to Tim's, we also have the group adaptive design in Pearls. Pearls was actually the first one that tried that out. And so, same as before, it aims to improve the match between the assessment difficulty and the levels of reading achievement of students. With 3 types of passages, 3 levels of passages, difficulty, so difficult, medium, and easy, and then those are combined in different booklets. And I'm not sure if you're aware of a Pearls passage, but we have about 18 Pearls passages currently in the current Pearls assessment, and each text has about 500 to 800 words. So a Pearls text is a long text. But most of the time, what you have to read in normal life is also a long text. So that's why it seems to match quite well. So some examples of Pearls data. These are the findings from the previous cycle, actually in 2016. But we are much more interested in the upcoming 2021 results, because those are the information that actually came during the pandemic. So we are really interested in what the changes are between the 2 cycles. And that result will be actually announced 16th of May. So then you can see all the international results, and also nationally, most of the countries will have a national report about it. So I won't go into that much. So also for Pearls, there's a match, of course, with the SDGs, SDG 4. And there was a joint publication by UNESCO using the Pearls data to inform the SDG targets. This is one of the examples of our Compass Brief series. As I said before, these are to inform policymakers. And this one actually looks at student attitudes and motivations, and the trend of declining attitudes towards reading, as we saw that in Pearls 2016. And then for practice, so this is quite an exciting new avenue IEA is going into. So as I answered before already, an international comparative assessment is really for an international view on how students are achieving. On an individual student level or even on a school level, you can't say much about the international results from it. Of course, policymakers can learn a lot from it. Teachers can learn a lot from it also, but not for their classroom students, but more to get a general broad view about what is important to teach. So we have been struggling a bit to see how we can best inform teachers. And we came now up with a totally new teacher publication, and this is this one. This is the first one in a series that we are publishing together with Springer. Because we find it really, really important that we give back to teachers also. That's not always, easy. So with this book series, we actually aim to highlight and translate practical information derived from the IEA studies, using data in an actually suitable way to give back to teachers. This is all open access, all free to download. You can just go to the IEA website. It's all on there. You can print it. So our first book is actually putting Pearls to use in classrooms across the globe. And this is an overview of the chapter. So it actually aims to connect scientific knowledge about teaching reading comprehension with schools and classroom practice. So it's a really practical book to use. So it tries to help teachers use this Pearls data and scientific insights regarding reading comprehension in order to strengthen their teaching in reading. And as you can see, The book is derived in two parts. So the first one is from research to practice, and the second one is more about reading comprehension in a multilingual classroom. These chapters can be read separately. It's easier if you read the whole book. But it all both start with a general understanding about the scientific knowledge that there is already. And of course, it uses also the Pearls framework that we have. So I think countries around the globe are struggling sometimes with multilingual students in one classroom. And we had those 5 countries helping us on giving us good examples on how they are actually how their didactics or how their classroom practices are actually helping these students with different backgrounds. So also these give very practical tips and example lessons. So what we have on our website is actually a resource pack that is just freely downloadable. It has examples of Pearls passages you can just print out. And then you can give to your students. And then your students in your classrooms can actually take the test. And you then can compare it either to the international average or to your national average. So that's one thing. Then you can see what your students are doing a bit. But also, and that's most important, it has for each question the didactics on how to teach your children then if they don't know the answer to these. So it shows them what is the knowledge that they should know beforehand, or how you can then teach them with your help on how they can learn to understand better. So you get everything that you need for that. You get the scoring guides and you get the country data, you can download everything. What we are doing now, because everything is of course created in English. What we learned quite quick also already is that teachers really like the book and also like to have the teacher snippets that I will talk about later in their own language. So some of the countries that we are working with are now translating everything so that they can provide the materials in their own language. This is an example of Georgia. And I just went there because they had a big seminar launching the book and asking teachers or explaining teachers how they can work with it and asking teachers how we can improve on it because it's still a very new setup. And this is what I just called the teacher snippets. So that's a much more condensed information about practical ideas that come from the IEA data. So the book is, of course, really extended. It's really long. But these are just snippets, so little pieces of information, either, for instance, about how sampling works in international research, or what you can learn about students' attitudes, or an open classroom climate, or all different things that you can derive from IEA studies. Really easy access, printable information. So what is new in 2026? So first of all, it's all digital. So we will move away from pencil and paper to do fully digital. The second one is we have this interface that I just showed you also a bit. And we are expanding on that. And we have the ePearls tasks, as I said, fully integrated now. Of course, you can have the process data that you can use, that countries can use to further understand the data. And we are also researching automated scoring. We have that already for smaller answers, like one word answers, but we are trying to extend that, or Boston College is trying to extend automatic scoring, mostly because it's really helpful for countries. It takes much less time, and there's a lot of new developments in it now, so the systems can just do more than they can like 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And of course, we have the longitudinal option, because countries asked us, can we do it in pearls also? So we have it in pearls also for the 4th grade until the 5th grade, so 1 year. So where are we now in Pearls 2026? We just started, I think 2 weeks ago. No, 3 weeks ago. When was Amsterdam? 3 weeks ago. With the enrollments open for countries. The field trial will be in 2025. Then 2026 we'll have Northern Hemisphere countries main test. And then end of 2026 we'll have Southern Hemisphere main test. And in 2027 we'll have the publication of the results. And early 2028 we'll have the launch of the public release database and the documentation, the user guide. So this is quite exciting for us, the first step. Totally digital, so a lot of new experiences. So what are actually the benefits of participating in Pearls for a country? So first of all, monitor the system-level achievement trends in a global context. Monitor the impact of educational policies and pinpoint areas of strength and weaknesses, and stimulate curricular reform. It is a state-of-the-art assessment of 21st century reading skills. It can improve teaching and learning through research and analysis of Pearls data, including new and unique longitudinal option. As I said, you obtain rich questionnaire data, and you can have new insights into how successful readers navigate through the assessment instruments. Okay, I will leave this. Then we go to ICCS. So the only international study dedicated to exploring the ways in which students interact with the complexities of the modern global society, focusing on civic culture, social justice, human rights, and influences of the ever-changing political landscape. So ICCS is actually targeted at students at the 8th grade, so about 14 years old. They were previously conducted in 2009, 2016, and now in 2022. Yeah. So ICCS collects rich contextual data also about the organization and the content of civic and citizenship education in the curriculum, teacher qualifications and experiences, teaching practices, school environment and climate, information from students on beliefs, behaviors, and attitudes, as well as home and community support. I was asked beforehand to see if ICCS would be also possible at the primary level. Foom said that might be a question that you guys had, so I didn't know. I have to ask our experts and our study director, and the answer said, don't do it. So I'm sorry for that, but I can tell you still about what it is at the 8th grade. Mostly because the items are really too enhanced to do at a younger age than 14, or to do it like grade 4 with 10 years old. The expert advised against it for the ICCS items that we have that wouldn't fit. So this is the purpose of the study. It's to investigate students' conceptual knowledge and understanding of aspects related to civic and citizenship education. Because attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors are essential part of civic and citizenship, these are given quite a bit of attention in the study. And the student questionnaires are a bit longer and more detailed than in some of the other IEA studies. So with a very changing world, ICCS is the IEA study that has most work to keep up to the global context for the education. And of course, there's a lot of variation across countries also. So here on the screen, you can see some examples of these differing national contexts that need to be considered with ICCS. Therefore, more than other studies in IEA, there's a lot of room for regional models and for national adaptations. So, for instance, we have a European report, an Asian report, a Latin America report. They also, in their questionnaires, come together then as a region and make their own regional questions, and you can also add your national questions. So there's a big module that's the same for everybody, and then you have these regional and national adaptations in the questionnaires. So to consider these recent developments and also these challenges constantly in the global context, we identified content focus areas for this third cycle of ICCS in 2022, such as the impact of digital technology on civic engagement, migration and diversity, environmental sustainability, of course, young people's view on their political systems, as well as global citizenship. And this is the assessment framework. So it provides a conceptual basis for the international instrumentation for ICCS 2022, and is of course also developed with the participating countries. The assessment framework defines what is measured with regard to knowledge, attitudes, and engagement. So it describes the content domains, the cognitive domains, and the affective behavioral domains. Is an overview again of the instruments that we have. And these are the different content domains and subdomains. So the content domains describe areas related to civic and citizenship education about which individuals may have developed knowledge and understanding. And each content domain is divided into subdomains. And each subdomain is related to a number of aspects that may overlap also. So the first content domain is civic institutions and systems. And this relates to the mechanisms, systems, and organizations that underpin societies. The second domain is civic principles, and this is concerned with ethnical foundations of civic societies. They have civic participation. This refers to the nature of the processes and practices defining and meditating the participation of citizens in their civic communities. Then you have civic roles and identities. And this domain refers to formal and informal civic roles, citizenship, and the individual personal perception of being agents of civic action with connections to multiple communities. Yeah, so if you know, I'm struggling a bit with this. ICCS is not my topic. So pearls and tips are much more what I know. And ICCS, I was just taught by the study director very well, and Katie helped. But I think you get a very good overview of what it is now. So then ICCS also places just as much emphasis on the measurement of effective behavioral aspects as on the cognitive domains. So student attitudes, behaviors that are all relevant to civic and citizenship issues are organized according to these two effective behavioral areas. So the first one is attitudes, for instance, judgments in relation to ideas, people, objects, events, or situation. And the second one is engagement. So the interest in or the expectations of civic engagement through civic action and future political participation. So currently we are after the main test. So the field test took place in 2021. Most countries have done their main test already. They are half computer-based now currently. There are still a few countries that did paper, but in the next cycle that's no longer the case. And we actually have a date for the release, which is going to be 28th of November 2023. So quite quick already. And then the next cycle will be ICCS 2027. So this is a 5-year cycle, ICCS. So Tim's 4 years, Pearl's 5 years, ICCS 5 years. So I will very quickly go over the findings for 2016 because they all can be found in our website or on the Springer website, but you can click on our website and then find it. So these on the screen are some reports released for the last cycle of ICCS. And of course, we also try to connect to policy. We have a book that identifies the multiple ways that ICCS had contributed to national and international educational discourse, research, policy making, and practice. So this was a quite unique publication, and it's also, of course, open access like everything else. And of course, we have our compass briefs. And we have our teacher snippets. So teachers can also learn from the IEA data and use the IEA data how they wish to do so. So what are the benefits of participating in ICCS? Well, ICCS is quite a unique study. It investigates the ways in which young people are prepared for their roles as citizens. It addresses new and persisting challenges to CCE in the global context. It generates internationally comparable indicators of student civic knowledge, attitudes, and engagement. It monitors civic knowledge trends over time. It makes informed decisions on education policy and practice. And you can explore the contribution of education to sustainable development. I'm not going to stop because I'm going to quickly go to ICILS. Only 2 slides, I think. So ICILS is our computer literacy study, in which Thailand actually participated in 2013. ICILS has grown a lot, so we have 36 countries now, including like the Republic of Korea and Chinese Taipei. So ICILS is an international large-scale assessment of digital literacy competences and the context in which they are developed. 8th grade students, and it has, again, teacher questionnaire, school questionnaire. And of course, the national centers that participate. So this is one of the examples. It's already moving. So smart. So what they had, students actually had to fly with a little drone to either plant seeds or to give them water. And you were given a set of codes, and you actually had to fix a problem. And the idea was that we created a problem in the code, and the expectation was that students would actually just change a couple of things around, and that would fix the code. That was the idea. In the end, it turned out that 5 students were actually smarter than our programmers, because the idea was use as little differences in the code as you can to come up with the answer, and they come up with a littler solution than our programmers, which was really cool. We don't know which 5, but we know that there are 5. So that's quite. It's a new generation. Huh? They are better than we are, which is really great. So again, what are the benefits of participating in ICILS? It investigates the way in which young people are prepared for study, work, and participation in a digital world. It addresses persisting and new challenges associated with young people's development of essential 21st century digital skills. And it also examines the use of digital technologies in schools, in particular, how they are used to develop students' core digital competencies. So we talked a bit about the pandemic already. Of course, we were also affected by it, and our studies were also affected by it. So our previous study already collected some background data about describing the learning conditions prior to the pandemic. PEARLS was actually conducted in the pandemic. And we were also struggling a bit with how our studies could help or how our studies could create more data to help countries, also to help teachers with this global pandemic. So we actually started 3 initiatives during the pandemic. The quick one is a national study in Germany that we did. The ICILS teacher panel was a longitudinal study based on ICILS data, but changed for the situation. And the third one was actually an international survey created together with UNESCO, which is called REDS, that looked at a lot at student and teachers' well-being during the educational disruption. And what we also found in REDS is that both students and teachers reported challenges to their well-being during this disruption. And next to feeling overwhelmed with the COVID pandemic, over 50% of the students agreed that they were anxious also about their changes in schooling, which you can, of course, understand. So what are we doing in this year? So we just highlighted 1 year. So in 2023, this year, what we are going to do is we are going to launch Pearls. So the international release will be on the 16th of May 2023. We will launch the new cycle of Pearls, 2026. We will release the ICCS 2022 results on the 28th of November. The main test for TIMSS is being conducted with the release next year, and the main test for ICILS is going to be conducted with the release also next year. So it's going to be quite a interesting year, I think. Okay, that was it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely fascinating. Again, Federico, you can start.
Thank you, Andrea, for this second part. Very, very interesting, and really many compliments also for the work that the IEA does to turn the knowledge that it builds also into practical suggestions for teachers. When you started with like the big publication, academic like publication book for teachers, I was like, whoa, that's probably not the most accessible one, but the strategy that you put in place with the snippets and the blogs and those amazing lessons plans, yeah, kudos to you, because it's really great. I think one of the first questions that comes to mind is why Pearls not at grade 8 or ICCLS at grade 4? Because TIMSS is.
Yeah, TIMSS is. So TIMSS was always created as this cohort trend study in grade 4 and then grade 8. With Pearls, it is really about if you have the students at a certain level of reading to then use the reading to learn more. So it's this critical critical moment in time. That's why it's grade 4. We never thought about grade. Countries never ask for later. we can. No, it was never. No.
So
it was always.
Why TIMSS 2 grades?
Yeah, because TIMSS is also. We also did TIMSS in grade 12 at one point even. Because it keeps changing in time. So that was for the students like at gymnasium level, so just before they go to university, to see how they actually, what their results were in mathematics and science, just before they then went to, so that was only for that little part, but that was an international study. I don't know the answer. I wasn't there 65 years ago.
It might be country's priority, like 10 subjects. Yeah, let's keep track of them reading.
But no, so it's really from the beginning. So ICILS would be too hard for 4th grade. So you need to do that in 8th grade. Still, maybe that changes also with the changing of the society and changing with what students are currently doing with their laptops and with their. So that might change. But currently it's
If
it's
grade 8
8.
students can beat your coders,
Exactly.
maybe grade 4 can
Yeah,
take the test.
I believe it. Yeah.
And just to understand, ICCS and ICLS, are they in a block structure as well, or do students take the whole test
No, they're in a block structure as well.
as well?
Yeah.
All of
yeah,
them?
Yeah, all of them. Yeah.
Listening, looking at that presentation, thank you very much indeed. It was very stimulating, again, on lots of levels. One of my questions is when I looked at the levels that you were going to test on, in a sense, the first one was retrieval of knowledge and so forth, is they followed the 4 steps of Bloom's taxonomy, exactly, in terms of remembering, understanding, analysing, evaluating.
Yeah.
But it left out the top one, which is create. And in fact, the greatest test of someone's language ability is for them to create in a language. Why did you stop where you did?
Yeah, but that would mean assessing writing.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did that in the very first study that was conducted in IEA. So that was also why I was quite impressed with the presentation yesterday. Writing in an international context is almost impossible to do because it takes far too much time to then actually code it. So internationally, it takes so much time, resources also, that it doesn't add up to what you will actually get out of it in the end, internationally. Nationally, I 100% believe that you need to do writing assessments, but on an international level, that's really something that's that's really difficult, difficult to compare, difficult to code. You have very different levels of. So the languages that countries use, and then how to actually grade those or how to actually assess those in a writing assessment is, that's almost impossible to do. We had talked
did
about
Todd's
it.
presentation give you ideas as how that might happen? Yeah. Let's get you a mic, Todd.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Yeah, I find that interesting, and as it's a small world, after all, we worked with Terry Rocher, who's at the Ministry of Education in France, on a project to create some new assessments that he can share with you, the idea, but in fact it's a writing creation task that uses a bank of words it's a word arrangement task, and so there's no actual real writing, it's a drag and drop task, and so it can be scored automatically, and et cetera, in terms of originality and meaning and so forth. So it's not a real full creative writing task, but it has some aspects to it.
Yeah.
Although I did have another different question.
No, do please.
Which was, to what extent is reading on a screen the same thing as reading on paper, and to what extent does this new format get kind of mixed up with computer skills? Because at least recently I was doing some testing in some French classrooms that were a bit in the rural area, and it was kind of the first, we brought in tablets to do testing on. It was kind of the first time they had manipulated this in a real way, and so most of the session was just figuring out where not to click and not actually doing anything. So that's all.
Yeah, definitely. So first of all, Thierry Rocher is the IEA chair. So IEA is constantly developing, constantly trying to see. So writing is one of the interests. So that's great if you can come up with something that would help. We go for it. Yeah. So nationally, it can work. Internationally is difficult, but it's definitely something to explore further and to see. Yeah, the big discussion whether reading online is the same as reading on paper. We had a lot of discussions on it. We had, of course, a linking study to make sure that the measurement was the same. We always have a reading development group which consists of experts throughout the world on the topic. We now have a professor who is actually exactly on that topic to help us and to learn from her. I think there isn't yet an answer. There isn't. We don't know 100% sure yet. We think it is. We see in the data from 2016, 2021 that it measures the same construct. Also with the new generation, just being used to reading online constantly. But there is a difference. I mean, you have linear reading towards non-linear reading, and that's the difference. But in general, as we see it now currently in the Pearls framework, is that it's the same. We can measure it in the same way. Yeah.
I'd just add to the point you were making to begin with. I was very interested in T and Ricardo's presentation, that there was evidence of learning the system going on in the first test, whatever the first test was when they randomized it. But within 3 minutes, they'd cracked it. And we talked at the end of the session about whether on that bank there should be another game right at the start, just a 3-minute game, which they learn that stuff and then do it. They are so fast, and these are kids who would not have come across a tablet or anything like that at all, but their ability to pick up and understand that, if you construct it right, is absolutely fine.
And that's something that IA Studies does, right? So before you enter a test, you always get the instruction. So you have like 10 minutes playing with the system and seeing how Mr. Raptor reacts and where you're supposed to click and where you're not supposed to click. Yeah. And so that's of course in there also.
I wanted, you said, because we were interested about the extent to which ICCS could be used at younger children, and you spoke to the developer who said, don't try. Did he say anything else? Because I find that really curious.
Yeah, it's mostly because the items are too enhanced for them, for that level of... Yeah, we had a big discussion about it also, if you could even try, but the world views are just not that developed yet in 10-year-olds. And their values and the way they see the world isn't developed enough for a study like this. I'm not saying you can't do another study. You can rearrange the items, and you can, ask in a different way, and you can. It's not the case that you can't do civic and citizenship education assessment at all at 10-year-olds. Just our ICCS assessment is really targeted at a specific rate, and the way our questions are developed are to enhance to use.
Is it a vocabulary issue? Or?
Also, yeah, but it is also how you view the world and how you view politics and what you know already. You need a lot of background knowledge to answer most of the questions, and you don't have that background knowledge yet as a 10-year-old.
So it's really a test of knowledge. Also,
it's a knowledge test and an attitudes test, and so the knowledge part is there. It's a cognitive test, It's a knowledge test also.
No,
so you just don't have that yet. You can do it another way, but not
the
with
reason
ICCS.
I say is I did a workshop once for 30 5 to 9-year-olds in Perth in Western Australia. And they came to a venue which was a big open space, effectively. They were all from the same school, and they were actually in classes which had vertical integration, so they were used to working with each other across there. And they arrived in this space, and I'd marked out areas on the floor, and I divided them into groups, and I said, right, each one of you is a different tribe, and each one of you is getting one of these areas. And here's a pile of cardboard. Make some things which would make a nice community with the cardboard, if you see what I mean. And they all settled down, and they got busy, and so on and so forth, and they did this for about half an hour, and they made various buildings. and so forth. And at the end of half an hour, we had a reflection. And we said, oh, that's really great. But what about children? You really haven't done anything for children in this space. And they, oh, yeah, what was it? Maybe a playground, maybe a school. What about sick people? Oh, yeah, maybe a hospital, so on and so forth. And so we said, yeah, those are good ideas. So they said, oh, we're going to build some of these. Can we have some more cardboard? We said, no. You've got to use the cardboard you've already got. So you're going to have to get rid of some of the things you've already made in order to make these things if you think they're of more value. So these huge arguments broke out because they'd built a palace for the mayor was one of the things, and as to whether they were going to keep the palace or destroy it in order to make a hospital and so forth. Absolutely fascinating conversation between 5 and 9-year-olds. Then I took them outside to do something for a bit, and whilst they were outside, brought another group of children in who took over a big area, took out the nice buildings and put it in their lap. And then I said to the other people, oh, some people have arrived in boats and they've taken over a bit of this. So the children all come back and they're absolutely horrified. You can't do that. That's my land and those are my things and so on and so forth. So this big argument starts about that. And we'd done something with the invaders to have a backstory. So they all settled down into groups and they had a backstory, and the invaders said, oh, we lived on this island over there and there was a huge volcanic eruption and we all had to, most people died, just a few people survived, and we arrived here and now we didn't know there were other people living here, so we didn't mean to steal all your things and so on and so forth. So there was a big discussion about it, and eventually a solution began to emerge that maybe you could have a bit of land in one or two of these buildings. You couldn't take everything that you graded and so on and so forth. And then in each tribe, they voted on this solution. And the majority said, yes, okay, we'll give them something. The others had said, once you give them something, another load of boatloads are going to come over here, and then there'll be nothing left for us, and so on and so forth. These are 5 to 9-year-olds having this conversation, and so forth. And they had a vote, and then the people who were against accepting these immigrants said, we refuse to accept the vote, and we're going to go over there and we're going to start a new community, and then we're going to invade and grab back all our things and so forth. And I remember this little 5-year-old girl being absolutely furious. And what she was furious about was not so much they didn't accept the immigrants, but they had debated it and they had taken a vote. And that was how you ran society. And if you were not willing to live with that, then then you should leave society, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, so that is a great lesson plan. So that is something that you can give to teachers and tell them if you want to start a discussion about civic and citizenship, then you can. This is a great example. But doing an international comparative research is something different. That has nothing to do with each other. And I'm not saying, the only thing I'm saying you can't do ICCS as we build it now, younger than the 14-year-olds. You can't do it with 10-year-olds, you can't do it with 5-year-olds. That's all. I'm not saying that you can't teach children already the basics.
I didn't teach them
totally
anything.
Different.
I didn't teach them
No,
anything.
but you are, of course you are, because in the lesson you are giving them different situations, and you are, as you are going along, teaching them, if you do this, then this happens, which is great, which is something that, all teachers can do. But assessing internationally civic and citizenship education is something different.
But what they were demonstrating is a deep understanding of civic values.
Yes,
but what you're
which
testing
is great
is what you were taught. And I don't think that's what we want to know.
Well, then you are apparently interested in something else than the countries are interested in. You are in a, it's a very small, in one student, one classroom, but that's different than testing in an international setting with 60 countries, where you want to have a global idea about what is actually happening in civic and citizenship education throughout.
Yeah, absolutely. But if you go back to what Dr. Vishan was saying at the beginning, is that what we want to be able to assess is the values and attitudes of our students, right? Not what they remember they were taught about their values and attitudes.
But don't you agree that how teachers are approaching certain things is how they learn and what they learn and how they also get their values. Nobody gets a value. You're born and you get a value. You get values and you get information about environment and about politics by your surroundings. You get it from everybody around you, from your parents, from your siblings, from your peers, from your soccer team, and also from the teachers. So you learn all these things, and definitely with civic and citizenship, it isn't the case that you only learn it at school. You learn it in a very broad, and then we test what they actually know about it and how they actually feel about it, what their values are at the 14-year-olds.
It's a very different conceptualization of learning, I think, that you're talking about and that I'm talking about. But that's very interesting. More questions? No. You've given us so much today and so many different surveys. And that's absolutely amazing. So let's go to a coffee break and we'll be back in 15 minutes.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Am I wrong? Okay. We're ready to continue. We're standing near there.
It's all good.
Over to you.
All right, thank you. Well, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for listening in advance and being interested in some of the work that we're doing at ACER. I'm Claire Schooler, and I'm a senior research fellow there based in Melbourne. But of course, we have international offices all over. A lot of the work that ACER contributes to is in the large-scale assessment development space. We contribute to PISA and CPLM, ICCS. But you've heard a lot of the perspectives about those large-scale international assessments already. So I wanted to flip it around a little bit and talk about some of the more conceptual work that we're doing. The work I'm leading is a program at ACER we've developed where we are trying to dig a bit deeper into the conceptualization of the skills and validate those skills from a progressive perspective. So I'll talk a little bit about that today, the methodology that we use to try to really understand these skills that we're trying to generate more emphasis around. So we know what the problem is. That's been well versed. We've been dealing with it for quite some time. There's shifts happening globally where we need a different set of skills or a greater emphasis on a particular set of skills as the world grows and expands in certain directions. This problem isn't new, but we're still grappling with it, despite this particular graph finishing in 2011. But what I'm slightly concerned about is that in trying to solve this problem, we've actually started to almost generate a new problem for ourselves. This is a short version of all the things that we're trying to achieve now in education beyond knowledge. So on top of all the learning areas that we have in our curriculum, we're also trying to teach all of these things that at least in one or two frameworks, these are included as skills. And certainly most of these have been discussed over the last couple of days as well. Now, I'm certainly not refuting that any of these aren't important. They most definitely are. And if we were to look at developing people holistically from birth right through to the end of life, then all of these skills are needed in the modern world. But to me, it looks very overwhelming and nearly impossible for a single teacher to take on all of this as well as the learning domains. So what we're trying to do in our program is to strip back to what are the essential skills. What is it that we just cannot live without? And what skills go across both the early learning all the way through to higher education and of course into the workforce as well, and not just focusing on that K-12. There is a large abundance of wonderful frameworks out there. And you can see just some examples here of both national frameworks, global frameworks. But at the heart of them, they're all trying to achieve the same thing. And so what we're really keen not to do is just add another framework to the ever-growing set of frameworks that we have. Each has its own purpose, and each country, as you have here in Thailand, has your own agenda and priorities. So it makes sense for you to potentially have a framework of your own that speaks to your needs and your interests in the types of skills that you want to focus on. But we are seeing some skills appear consistently across all of these frameworks that have been developed, and people have spent a great deal of time and effort developing. So what we've been doing is looking at what those key skills are. We've also been doing a lot of talking with teachers. For us, this isn't about adding on top of what they're already doing, but instead building a greater emphasis on the skills part of what they're doing in the classroom already. So we've been talking to a lot of teachers, both in Australia and globally, about what the types of skills that they think they're already assessing and teaching are in the classroom, and then helping them to further advance their knowledge and understanding of what that looks like. Through all of these communications, collaborations, we identified that we really need to set off with identifying what the immediate needs are. What can we help to address conceptually that will help the focus of these of all of this global work that's coming together, and will help to deepen some of the actual impact of all the frameworks that have been put together. So we identified 3 immediate needs. The first one is that we need to understand development. We need to work out from a skills perspective, how do these skills actually develop in students? For example, to what extent do we expect to see a 10-year-old present critical thinking skills? And what does that look like in a 10-year-old versus what it might look like in early childhood or in adulthood? So we need to understand that development. And in that sense, we've developed 3 skill development frameworks with another 3 to come that outline our essential skills. The second immediate need is to monitor growth. So you'll hear throughout my presentation, the focus that we have on growth is basically at the center of everything that we do. The whole point in doing this, of course, is to actually develop student skills. And we need to monitor that growth to ensure that we're actually doing that. So within our development frameworks, we have levels of proficiency or learning progressions. And then finally, although of course it's a really big ask, ideally, we need to ensure that we have alignment. So it's fantastic if we have really robust assessment practices and assessment data that can tell us lots of information about these skills. But unless that gets fed back into what we're doing from a pedagogical perspective, what's being taught to students, and unless that we're embedding learning outcomes that relate to the skills in our curriculum, then we don't really have cohesiveness or harmony. So again, a big ask, because I know that that notion of harmony across the education system doesn't really necessarily always happen for any area, and particularly not for the skills. But it's definitely something that we can see as an immediate need and something that we should be aiming for. This is only one piece of research that we've looked at. Obviously, we looked at a lot more, but we're just looking at, again, a large list of skills, lots of really interesting concepts, important constructs, but looking at, in this particular graph from 2020, the skill demands in the proportion of total job advertisements. So as I mentioned, we're not just thinking about what's happening in school, but what students are actually going to need when they leave school. What are the in-demand skills that employers are looking for? And then taking that right back to early childhood and saying, well, what are the foundational skills that we need so that when children get to school, they are able to build continuously on those skills, and it's not a new set of skills that they're having to get their heads around. So I'm not expecting you to read this particularly, but I wanted to just demonstrate that we've done quite a lot of thinking around this conceptually to result in our shortened versions of skills. So one of the big things for us is, can we actually develop it? Is what we're identifying, is the construct we're looking at, is it malleable? And if it is, then we progress it to the next level. The next thing we look at is it possible that it's through teaching and intervention that we can develop it? Is there an onus on the teachers to encourage the development of this? Or is it something that might just naturally mature in children? The next step is to identify whether it is indeed a skill-based construct, or whether it could be something that is an attitude or an attribute or a disposition or a character or a value. As I mentioned, these things are very, very important and they impact on the skills, but our particular focus was on those real skill-based constructs. And then the next step was to identify whether it is indeed in and of itself a skill. And I'll talk a little bit later about some of the overlap that we see with our essential skills. They don't exist in isolation, and we've been hearing a bit about that already this week. But can we define it in a skill in and of itself? And if so, again, it's included. And then finally, can we assess it? And that's the big one that we're all here this week to uncover. What skills can we assess reliably and validly? And what does the data say about these skills that we can filter back into our understanding about them? So this is where we landed. these skills met our criteria, and this is our 4 central pieces of criteria. We have self-regulation, creative thinking, collaboration, critical thinking, emotional development, and communication. So we are representing cognitive skills here, and we're also looking at the skillful elements of social-emotional development. We identified all of these skills as essential for learning. And we identified all of these as being able to be understood from a growth perspective. We can identify linear levels of progress in each of these. We deem these skills to be teachable. We're able to foster and nurture these in the classroom, and we can identify different interventions and pedagogical strategies to enhance students' progress in these skills. And finally, they're measurable. We can understand each of these skills in a way that we can observe and we can see students demonstrate in the classroom. The way that I'll sort of go through each of the 3 immediate needs now again and demonstrate how we've tried to address these so far. So back to part 1, which was understanding development. As I mentioned, we've developed 3 skill development frameworks for the first 3 skills we focused on, which is creative thinking, critical thinking, and collaboration, with the other 3 in development due for release about June of this year. So the idea is that we'll have all 6 skill development frameworks complete mid-year, as well as those levels of skill development for each. I've got some versions of the documents here today, the sort of abbreviated versions. They're up here. If you want to help yourself, please feel free to take them or take them for colleagues. I'll not be taking them back with me, so please help yourself. These are intended for teachers, really, or to get a snapshot of the longer documents, which goes into the background literature and really outlines a lot more detail, as well as the levels. But they're meant to be a reference guide. They take each of these skills and they break them down into the component strands and aspects. And they have, as I mentioned, levels of proficiency or levels of skill development for each of those aspects. It seems really obvious for us sitting here, but we are defining these skills in a learning, I should say here, learning context rather than education context. I think it was Hannah who mentioned earlier that learning doesn't stop at the end of school, and we're learning every day in life, and that's part of the excitement of life, is to continue to learn. So we are thinking about these skills from a learning perspective. And again, it might seem a slightly obvious one to some of us here, but we're also thinking about these from a goal-orientated perspective. For us, a large part of applying the skill is that there's a requirement to do so. So it's just sitting, thinking critically, or just sitting, thinking creatively. There's not much purpose in there in regards to learning. We have to apply that thinking to something, to a particular context. And so that might be some real-world problem that we face, or it might be knowledge and building our knowledge in the learning domains. And a large part of what these frameworks is trying to do is come up with some consistent terminology. It's probably a big ask that globally we have a consistent terminology to define these skills, but at least at a school level, we do need one. And many of the schools that we've gone into, that's been the biggest hurdle that they face internally, is that they're using different words to describe the same thing. And so that concept of transferability of the skills across different learning areas isn't going to happen very easily or effectively if the different teachers in teaching different domains have different conceptualizations or different words that they're using to describe those students across the different areas. And the same thing is happening across from early childhood transitioning into school, from school transitioning to higher ed, and from higher ed transitioning into life. When we really look at what many of the skills are talking about, the terminology that they're using, there is a lot of consistencies there. So just trying to have that golden thread that goes through everything. And if we can become more aware of that terminology and use that terminology all of a sudden we're on the same page, we're talking about the same thing, and it's much more likely to be effective and, of course, very efficient. The levels of skill development, as I say, we can think of them as learning progressions, and the idea here is that not only can teachers start to identify where students are currently at in terms of each of these skills, which level of proficiency they have, but also what they need to do to get to that next level. And there are also criterion reference descriptions of quality of the skill. So that means that we're not comparing student to student, we're comparing student to criteria that we expect to be differentiated into different levels of quality. So what does a lower performing critical thinker look like? What does a medium level and what does a high level critical thinker look like? And we'll get into a little bit of that later. We've conceived these frameworks in a general way, but our acknowledgement around this is that we can define, as I said, what critical thinking is at a general level, but in order to apply it effectively, we need to apply it to something. What are we thinking critically about? So we can use the same terminology in history and science and maths and geography to describe what critical thinking is, but these students might perform differently across each of those different learning domains, given that they have different levels of knowledge in each of those two. And we really want to take an evidence-based approach. Those in test development will be familiar with this broader methodology or broader approach to assessment development, where we start with the definition of the construct, which is what we're doing with these frameworks. We develop assessments to measure the strands and aspects in those frameworks, and criterion referenced rubrics in order to measure those. And a large part of what I'm going to demonstrate is our validation process and how we have fed back in all of what we've taken out of the assessments to really inform these frameworks so that they become evidence-based and something that teachers can feel confident about using. I keep saying teachers, but systems as well. Okay, I thought we might, just to break up me talking, we might just do a little reflection exercise. So if you have picked up one of these, don't look at it yet. I thought we'd focus on collaboration because we're all here to do just that. And this is a wonderful opportunity to collaborate. So what I want to know, they're going to bring up a Slido in a second, is what your conceptualization of collaboration is. And I think you've got a little bit of space to enter some of the words or phrases that first come to your mind when you hear the word collaboration. Is that the QR code for the... Okay. So if you scan this QR code, it should take you to, yeah, this one. So what comes to mind when you think about collaboration? Okay, this could go on forever, so I'll pause the activity there, but also because I'm needing better glasses to actually even read what's been written. I think we can see the overall reigning word of interest was teamwork. And we see a lot of other relevant words there. Participation, negotiation, common purpose, compromise, sharing. That's certainly coming out. And yeah, communication, roles. Yeah, a lot of really important things there. We've had 30 plus people contribute, and already you can see, and this is a very simplified way of what we've tried to achieve in the sense of bringing together lots and lots of different ideas across the research and literature, and looking for commonalities in there, and trying to find a way to describe a set of strands and aspects that really fully encompasses what collaboration is all about. So we'll go back to the slides. So I'll just walk you through how we've conceived collaboration in our framework, and you'll see a lot of the words that you were all contributing in that exercise. But you'll possibly see other things that you maybe didn't consider initially too. So when we trialed this with a number of teachers from we have an international working group that of teachers that we tested our initial conceptualizations out with in regards to the framework. We wanted to ensure the language we were using was appropriate, the terminology and so forth. So initially when we asked them what was collaboration, there was really actually only two things that came up in regards to that. It was aspect 1.1, communicating with others, and aspect 2.1, participating in the group. So how much verbally you engage, but also how much you physically sit with the group and how much you contribute and share and so forth. And these were the only really two that kept coming up time and time and time again. And we also asked teachers to observe and evaluate their students on very, very broad levels of skill development based on their understanding of collaboration. So from a 1 to 5, how does your student demonstrate collaboration skills? What was really interesting in that experiment was that then ultimately when we revealed what our framework was, there was a lot of different things that teachers hadn't considered as a part of collaboration. And when we described this to them and said, oh, I actually observe that all of the time in my classroom, but I wouldn't have connected that with the skill of collaboration. So one of the points I'm trying to make here is that unless we clearly describe what the skills are to both teachers and students and parents, then it's not necessarily fair to expect them to be able to gain a reasonably good estimate of what their students' collaboration skills are, or any of their skills are, or indeed progress or develop those skills. So we can see here that we've got 3 strands. The first is building a shared understanding. Under that we have communicating with others, which I think is fairly self-explanatory. Aspect 1.2 is pooling resources and information. So we conceive of collaboration as there being a need to collaborate. We found that not just students, people in life don't tend to like to collaborate unless they have a common purpose or a need to collaborate. If you can do it yourself, most of the time you will go off and do it yourself. It can actually be ineffective to involve other people if you're capable of doing it yourself. So not every single activity, task, problem needs multiple perspectives, but there are many, many, many situations in which we can benefit from collaborating with others. What we're trying to do in education systems in terms of collaboration is emulate real life, where in the workforce you will need to work with people who have different perspectives than you, have different opinions, have a different piece of the puzzle, have different expertise or knowledge that you don't have different experiences, even potentially different cultural or language skills that you don't have. And so the whole can be more effective than the sum on their own, the parts on their own. So I'll talk a little bit later about how we design collaborative tasks in an education system to emulate that real world scenario. But it involves having different students take on different roles and responsibilities. And part of that, and of course we scaffold this depending on the age of students, is to have to negotiate roles and responsibilities. By proxy of having those different roles and responsibilities, we need to identify what those are and how you deal with those. And different roles and responsibilities are likely to come with different skill sets, different attributes that you might need to bring to bear on that role. The next strand focuses on the actual contribution and the collective contribution to solving the problem or completing the task. And that participation in the group is really helpful. We can see it physically, or we can see it in a virtual environment where we're not sharing resources or sending each other the information that the others require. And the next aspect is recognizing the contribution of others. And this is where we started to see some sort of not necessarily thinking that was a part of collaboration. It was the listening, the receiving part of the collaboration. So identifying what it is that you don't know, and then recognizing that other person has that particular piece of the puzzle that would really be beneficial to the team, and incorporating that and acknowledging that. And beyond just negotiating your role, you actually have to engage in that role. So I'm sure we've all been in a situation where you are working in a team, you've allocated roles, everybody goes off to complete that work, and someone comes back inevitably and has not done their piece of the puzzle. It happens no matter what age you are, in what industry that you work. And so, having that responsibility to actually engage and follow through is really, really vital to that collaboration. And then the third strand of regulating, we have 4 aspects. The first one is regulating your own contributions, ensuring that what you're contributing is valuable, it is on task, it is in the defined role that you have. The next aspect is resolving differences. So we've not got an expectation here that we all need to agree. We can agree to disagree and still move on effectively and complete the task or solve the problem. It can actually be very beneficial to disagree with others when you're working in a team with them, because you can learn from their different perspectives, or you maybe even take on a different piece of knowledge or information that you didn't have before. But that goes back to ensuring that what we're contributing in terms of our own unique knowledge and information is constructive. And maintaining a shared understanding. So this is the concept of going back and making sure that we're all on the same page about what it is that we're meant to be doing. Perhaps it's a case of going back to that role engagement. Someone just might not be able to complete their task. Maybe they find it too difficult, and we need to renegotiate some of those roles. Finally, the last one, it's very, very challenging, both to actually measure and observe, but also very high up in terms of the level of mastery of collaboration. And that's adapting our behavior and contribution for others. Again, a very familiar scenario is sometimes when we're trying to explain something to someone and they just aren't getting it, and then we will try to explain it, and what we always do is try and explain it in the exact same way, and they're not going to get it because that's not in line with their understanding. So really perceptive collaborators will transform their communication style to suit the needs of the receiver. So they'll adapt their behavior. So maybe instead of verbally describing your concept or your thinking, you would start to scribble a diagram on a piece of paper and you would just explain it to them that way. And you get over that communication hurdle from working together. You're getting on the same page, you're working together, you're being effective. But as I say, that's quite high up in our levels of proficiency. It doesn't always happen. So I wanted to give you a little bit of insight into our conceptualization of collaboration and just do a little bit of a recap on your own reflection, mainly because I'm interested myself, but also just to not have me talk constantly. If you can have a think about what I've just explained in terms of my definition of collaboration and go back to your original thinking around it and identify whether my description connected with yours. So did it resonate with you? You said, that was the same conceptualization that I had of collaboration. Did it in some way extend yours? Was there one of the aspects on there that you hadn't conceived of as being relevant for collaboration? Or did your definition and mine challenge one another? Is there something in there that you didn't agree with, or something that you didn't think was necessary? All right, thank you, everyone. Really interesting to see your reflections. I could spend a whole session on this, to be honest, but we've got a lot else to cover. So we can take the debate onwards and upwards, but if you've got any specific thoughts around this too, please just continue the conversation with me online as well. Would love to hear your thoughts. So we'll go back to the slides. I'll have a look at these polls at the very end as well after the session, out of curiosity. So obviously we've got the same setup for critical thinking and creative thinking. I don't want to spend too much time describing these in too much detail because I've got so much else to cover. But it's kind of essential you get the essence of our frameworks so you can see how we're measuring them. So bear with me as I go through the other two. And as I say, please do feel free just to come up and take the paper versions of these if you would see any value in that. For critical thinking, we also divided it up into three strands. Coincidentally, they all ended up into three strands, but it was purely coincidence. The first strand is knowledge construction. So this is a concept that we are reflective and engaging in our knowledge construction process. So in critical thinking, we first need to know what we don't know in order for us to identify whether there's anything else that we need to go out and get in terms of the information. So identifying gaps in our own knowledge is one of the first sort of steps in the process for engaging in that critical thinking. The next aspect is discriminating amongst information, and this is becoming more and more valuable in modern society as we're engaging online and with free access to information and so forth. So this idea that, where is the source of information where is the information coming from? What is the source? Is the source reliable? During COVID, of course, when we were all online, this was very vital from a healthcare perspective as well. What should we be doing that has been identified as being relevant and healthy and being conscious as a citizen about how we go about engaging in society in a way that is healthy. So being able to discriminate between different pieces of information and different types of sources is really, really important. Looking for bias and so forth. The next aspect is identifying patterns and making connections. So we're moving into that logic space, but we're not quite there yet. We're maybe organizing information. We're seeing how pieces of information connect together. We're finding patterns. The next strand is evaluating reasoning, and for most, that's where we have quite a strong understanding of what critical thinking is. The first aspect, it's applying logic, and we know that we apply logic, being able to use our reasoning skills. We look at whether conclusions are valid or not. We look at whether we're making assumptions or there's contradictions. We use our applied logic to manage these situations. Part of reasoning as well is to identify assumptions and motivations. So we might see, for example, arguments being made that aren't reasonable, and we as people and students as well need to be able to identify whether an argument that's been made has been supported by some evidence or has been informed by an alternative motivation. So ensuring that we are identifying what is an assumption and what is a motivation appropriately. And justifying arguments. This is a huge one for students to learn very early. How can we provide an explanation of why we're doing something, or why we've made a decision, or why we've behaved in a certain way? How can we justify that argument, back it up with evidence? Where did our opinions come from? Where did our ideas come from? So potentially avoiding biases in our own reasoning, and being able to provide some balanced evidence for presenting our own justifications. In strand 3, we went with decision making, although we're aware that there's not always a decision to be made. So we're using decision making in a very loose way conceptually, in the sense that you've got to land somewhere when you're thinking critically. It's about landing somewhere. It's about an end goal or purpose. So it might be picking a solution to solve a problem, or it might be choosing a task to go on to do next. And as part of that decision-making process, you actually have to work out what the criteria is for making that decision. We don't always get given the criteria. We might need to identify what that is for ourselves. So in order to make an effective decision, we need to work out what the needs are for making that decision. What's our criteria? What would make one solution more optimal than another, for example? And of course, evaluating our options. Particularly in the problem-solving world, we might be faced with some ill-defined problems that don't have one specific solution. Maybe there's 10 possible solutions. Maybe one's more optimal than the other. And we would use our criteria that we've identified for decision-making to identify which decision was more optimal than the other. But we need to be able to evaluate those options. And finally, we need to test and monitor that implementation. Let's say we've made a decision and we've landed on where we need to be, but we think it's the most optimal. We try it out and it isn't, or it doesn't work, or we think we've made the wrong decision. So we need to go back a couple of steps and say, let's reevaluate. Maybe let's even adjust our criteria and say, okay, what do we actually need to do here? Let's have another go. And with all of these frameworks too, we're really emphasizing the need and the fact that it is okay for students to reevaluate their options, to go back a few steps and reconsider the decisions that they've made. Making mistakes is okay, making errors and judgment is fine, but understanding what those are and learning from them is a huge part of applying these skills. And so by building in some of this decision-making criteria into their critical thinking, they have a justification for why they ended up where they ended up. And they have a criteria for being able to go back and reevaluate those decisions that they made. Finally, for creative thinking, we also have, as I said, 3 strands. The first strand is to do with the generation of ideas. So there's only 2 aspects in here. The first one is number of ideas. So number of ideas does tell us something, but it's obviously not, creative thinking is not just how many ideas we can generate, but it's also the range of ideas. And we can actually look at these 2 criteria, or these 2 aspects together, to give us a bit of a bigger picture. So evaluating, from our research, what we've been finding is that actually there's a connection between these 2 aspects, in that typically the more ideas you have, the wider range you're likely to end up with as your creative thinking process sort of churns away. Under the second strand of experimentation, we've got another 2 aspects here. The first is shifting perspective. Now, that might be looking at, say, a problem or an activity from an alternative perspective. We might have to think flexibly, which is a really common occurrence in creative thinking, and shift maybe the boundaries of the task. Maybe we just can't solve the problem, and so we need to think differently about the problem, look at it from a different angle, maybe even bring somebody else in and ask their perspective on the problem, and see if there's another way that you can go around it. And the next is manipulating ideas. So we might have to actually, again, apply flexibility to this one and take apart the problem. Let's take it apart a little bit and look at the different components and see if it looks a little bit different when we break it down into different parts. And then third, the quality of ideas. So we, as I mentioned before, we could just sit and think creatively if we wanted to, but what's the point? What's our end goal here? And is the ideas that we come up with, or the solutions that we come up with, fit for purpose? Do they actually solve the problem that we're trying to solve, or did they solve some other problem that we didn't conceive of before we started on this journey? If what we produce is of absolutely no value, then it doesn't necessarily demonstrate creative thinking. We also want to include novelty, and we are all familiar with what we mean when we talk about novelty, but there's a caveat in that novelty will be age and context dependent. So it's very difficult to come up with criteria referenced quality around this particular aspect that we're trying. You know, what is novel to a grade 5 student compared to a grade 10 student would likely be very different. And so it's not about being the next Einstein in this particular case. It's not about thinking of something that's never been thought of before, but it's about thinking of something that's novel in your particular context. And finally, elaboration. So you might have come up with a really good idea or a really good solution, but you haven't really expressed why it's a good solution. You haven't convinced me. You need to elaborate. And that elaboration helps us to see that critical thinking process projected back. How did they land on that idea? What was the process that they went through? And if they're able to elaborate on that idea or solution, then they're able to, we're able to see that full creative thinking process. So over the next hour or so, I'll show you some examples how we're measuring each of these aspects in various forms of assessment. That's part 1, trying to understand what the skills are. Part 2 is understanding the growth, and I'm going to introduce it here, but I'm going to leave it and jump back to it much later. But this is from our snapshot of our collaboration learning progressions. What I wanted to demonstrate here was that in most cases we have approximately 5 levels of skill development, and we break them down into their relative strands and aspects. So you can see the columns here representing the 3 strands of collaboration, but you can also see in brackets the relevant aspects that they link to in our frameworks. So there's levels for each and every aspect. And the reason that we've done this is that we're actually it was interesting because as we were consulting with our teacher focus groups, we had thought they would want something really simple, narrow down what these skills are, make it really simple, make it brief, help them to integrate it. And we sort of started with that. We actually started with the descriptions on the right-hand side. And they said, no, actually, we want much more than that, which we were surprised about because we felt like the frameworks on the left were going to be really overwhelming for them. But in fact, the all unanimous agreement in our focus groups was that they wanted that more nuanced detail. They wanted us to break it down. And by breaking it down, what we're doing is making it more manageable for them to integrate. Instead of going into a classroom and saying, right, today we're going to teach creative thinking, well, that means you're teaching technically 7 sub-skills in one lesson. That's a lot. It's very, very, I think it's fair to say it's nearly impossible unless you spend your whole time on that and you're not learning any of the knowledge content. So that's not the expectation here, but the expectation is that we can focus instead of on creative thinking or critical thinking, we focus on these aspects. So today we might focus on looking at problems and trying to look at these problems from different perspectives from people. Or today we work on elaborating how solutions might be suitable. So we're really narrowing in, and by narrowing in, what we're able to see is that they relate much more readily to existing activities in the curriculum and in the classroom. So that's why we have gone down to that granular level of describing specifically how the aspects look at different levels. And so, you know, if today we're teaching collaboration and we're focusing on your ability to negotiate with others, we can see what that looks like at different levels. We can identify which students in our classroom are at each of those levels. And by identifying where the students are at, we can then look to the next level above it to see where it is that they need to go. And we can come up with appropriate pedagogical strategies for moving them to that next level. And of course, we can use this as a monitoring and assessment tool. And I'll get into that a bit later. But we can track student progress using these levels of skill development. I'll move on to part 3. Part 3 will be really brief, and then we'll get into the assessment. But I did just want to take the opportunity to touch base about where all of what we're talking about fits inside of the bigger picture. As I say, it's probably an ambitious goal, is to have really strong alignment from what we're learning through the curriculum, what the learning outcomes are in the curriculum, to what we're measuring and assessing, to what we're teaching. But that's where we really need to go to be really, really effective and really efficient. So I was just trying to demonstrate here some of the approach that we're taking from the aspect level. So again, we're not talking here about how we, just at a general level, integrate collaboration across an education system, but instead, how do we integrate the aspects? So for example, you can see here, and I've just taken an example from the Australian curriculum because it was to hand, but you can see, for example, these 2 aspects, participating in the group and resolving differences. I've taken a snapshot from the learning outcomes from the curriculum documentation there. From the assessment criteria, you can see the levels of skill development at a very brief level, the high, mid, and low, and then propose teaching strategies for what they need to do. So this is a very narrowed down version of some of the resources that we've been developing for both education systems and schools. So that we're ensuring that what's happening in each of these components of the education system is focused on the same things. And we've done this work now, we've particularly looking at the alignment between the curriculum and the assessment outcomes with 30 or more countries, and really trying to come up with a strategic plan. So we haven't achieved alignment with over 30 countries. We've been looking at how it might be possible in existing education systems to move us towards that end goal. So working with countries to establish a plan for alignment and working with the relevant stakeholders in the countries to identify a pathway to execute that plan. So to ensure this alignment happens, there is 3 preparation steps that have needed to occur before we actually go on to looking at the different components of that alignment. So the first step is to establish a core strategy team. Now, in order to ensure alignment across each of the different components of the education system, we need stakeholders from those different divisions or components to come together to have that common goal. So we've been working with teams of 7, or between 5 and 7. We've got at least 1 representative from the assessment, 1 representative from curriculum, 1 representative from teaching interventions, and then 1 sort of central or 2 central people to drive it forward. And we've gone back and we've looked at mission and vision statements. So a lot of countries have a mission and vision statement that relates to the skills, but these tend to evolve, but also sometimes they don't get disseminated down to the grassroots in the classroom. So looking at how we might emphasize the skills a little bit more in education systems, mission and vision statements. And then looking to see the extent to which they have identified skills or adopted skill frameworks so far, and whether or not they're able to easily adopt these skill development frameworks, which fortunately have been useful for some countries too. Then you can see the steps that we have for each of those 3 components. There's 10 steps in total, and what we've been doing with countries is working through the priorities in terms of those 10 steps. What have they done so far in regards to skill integration? What do they want to do next? And how can we support them to get there? A lot of the work we've been doing at the moment is focused on auditing existing curriculum to see where the skills are currently embedded in the learning outcomes. And in a lot of cases, we're finding that they're implied, but they're not necessarily explicit. So we need to do a little bit more work to really emphasize the presence of those skills in the curriculum documentation. And also looking at existing assessments to see where we can also include more items that might measure some of the skills. This is one of the examples from one of the curriculum audits that we've done. This is actually one that was conducted as a test with the Australian curriculum. And it's a little bit outdated now, but it's suitable for the purposes of explaining where we were aiming with the curriculum audit. So you can see here we've got 7 general capabilities, which are the skills of focus in Australia down the first column. And along the top row, we have the learning domains that are integrated into the curriculum. And we can see the colours here. And I keep meaning to change the colour scheme because it doesn't really make sense. But the red, which normally indicates danger, is actually a good thing. So the darker the red, the higher the skills were integrated into the curriculum, or in the learning outcomes in the curriculum. And the blue, I suppose the colder, is the darker the blue, the lower the skill integration. So auditing the curriculum learning outcomes to identify these percentages. So yeah, we've worked with about 30 countries to do this. So in not all countries, some countries only picked 1 or 2 skills. Some countries also only picked a couple of grades or a few learning domains. It depended on what their priorities were at the time. This curriculum audit map can be used for 2 purposes. We're calling it a heat map. The first purpose is that we can see a bit of a lay of the land. What is currently happening in terms of the connection between our curriculum and our skills? Where do the skills currently live inside of our education system? Where are they presumably being taught? And the second thing we can use it for is to plan ahead. Certainly not the intention that we want or need to see all of these being dark red or even red at all. Maybe as an education system, we don't necessarily need to see all of these capabilities or skills equally represented either and across all the learning domains. But it might be that we thought we had more of a skill in a particular learning domain than we do. Or maybe we would like to see more of that skill developed through the learning domains. So we can look to the potential areas of interest and where we need to go next to further emphasize the skills in our curriculum documentation. So let's now think about, that's a bit of a background in terms of what some of the work we've been doing. We haven't really talked too much about assessment specifically. So I'll start to outline now some of the evidence that we've brought in to further validate some of these frameworks. So we've developed some critical thinking assessments for internal purposes really at the moment to validate the frameworks. So what we're trying to identify here is, to what extent is our definitions robust enough? Can we reliably and validly assess them using these frameworks? So building assessments from the frameworks and then identifying whether they're reliable and valid. So for critical thinking, our assessment involved 41 items in total, targeted to grades 6, 8, and 10. So some of the items were unique to those age groups, and some of the items were linking items that went across all of the age groups. And overall, we could see that the item facility, so the general difficulty of the assessment was at 64%, which means 64% of the students essentially did really well. And that was for all year levels, which meant it was maybe slightly on the easier side. We could have put in some harder items there. But for the year 8, for the items targeted to that age group, they did the best in terms of how they performed overall. 67% of them did really well. And you can see some good reliability there for the overall assessment. The blue boxes on top of our framework here just indicate the number of items that are the percentage of items that are allocated to each of those strands, and then in turn each of those aspects. And this probably represents quite fairly about where we feel we can, what aspects we feel we can measure really well versus the ones that we might be finding more difficult to capture in the types of assessments that we have been using at the moment. And this is where we're coming back to the conversation that we've been having over the last couple of days. How can we do this more innovatively? Having just digitizing paper and pencil assessments isn't going to get at some of these key creative thinking or critical thinking processes. And we can see that highlighted here. It's difficult to observe someone evaluating options or testing and monitoring implementation, sitting on a computer, entering words or clicking on buttons. We might need to provide them with something much more interactive, much more dynamic. Maybe they even need to go off to test and implement something and come back and report on it. So it might not be one administration for an hour sitting down with paper and pencil or computer to be able to get at some of these aspects reliably. But we can clearly measure many of them in that way. This is one of our items. It's about a mid-level one here. About 54% of the students did quite well on this one. It's probably a familiar one in terms of what we're actually asking the students to do. This is a generic example of the way we've measured strand 1, knowledge construction, aspect 1.3, identifying patterns and making connections. So we've come up with a generic template of trying to measure these aspects, but we know that this can go across different learning domains as well. We can identify patterns and make connections in geography, in history, in science, and we do it with words and text in English as well. So we conceive of the general idea, we can write general items to look at the general application of the skills. But we also want to be able to look at that inside of particular learning areas and look at the transferability of that. So how would a student perform on this item in each of those different contexts that I just mentioned, and how much, therefore, is their knowledge playing a part in how well they did in those items. So basically what we're asking the students to do here is to identify how we might categorize these different birds in different ways. So clearly we can see some, and this is just, these are just prototype versions of our items that I've got to hand, but we can obviously see in some cases the wings are spread, in some cases we can't see their feet, they're facing different directions, and so there's a whole lot of ways that we can categorize these different birds. We have taken this item offline and taken it into, and I'll talk about problem-based learning scenarios in a bit, but we've also looked at measuring some of these items in a more conversive, collaborative way with students. So for example, getting them to do a task like this, which has more malleable, tangible objects, and getting them to apply the exact same skills in a particular context. So in science, it might be categorizing different beakers, or it might be categorizing different shapes of objects, or categorizing different texts in English. And so it's much more hands-on. You can actually watch the process unfold, and you can involve the teachers and the students in that measurement. But of course, as we start to do that, it becomes much more about classroom assessment and student and teacher engagement than it does about standardized assessment. But ultimately, what we're doing here is measuring the same aspects. So, as I mentioned, that's very general. What we can also do is take the relevant pieces of the curriculum that we want to embed the skills in more. So thinking about critical thinking in science, if we wanted to measure critical thinking specifically in an area of the curriculum, we might look, for example, at distinguishing characteristics of different organisms. And so, again, we can look at measuring the aspect of identifying patterns and making connections, and we can also look at applying logic and so forth. Again, just one example of taking a very classic test item in science, and instead of measuring science, measuring critical thinking using that same item. So not very innovative, but moving in the right direction in terms of infusing or emphasizing the skills more in the existing assessments that we have. We are going to have to get, and we are getting much more innovative, but this is something we can do in the meantime, something that's familiar to us, and something that's increasing our understanding of where the students are at in terms of their critical thinking skills in and across these different domains. And just another example for maths. So thinking about looking at the concept of making decisions about particular long division video and having students involved in thinking about how effective things are and testing and monitoring that implementation. As well as the critical thinking assessment items, we've got some creative thinking assessment items where, again, you can see the sort of spread of percentage in regards to those items. And there were 67 in total, again, spread over the same age groups. And we're at 55% for the item facility here, which means slightly more difficult than the critical thinking. But it was also more difficult for year 6 than for year 8, and for year 8 than year 10. So this is telling us a little bit something about creative thinking in those younger years, whether it's not being taught as much, or whether it's not, we're not seeing it through the same aspects, or as much through the items that we're using to measure the construct. So this is an example item. Again, we're measuring 2 aspects in this particular item. We're looking at the number of ideas and the range of ideas. So the students are given the rules of a game and some of the resources that they have, such as music and an open space. And we're asking them to consider what rules they could add or change to the game to make it more interesting to play. So they've got an option to enter up to 3 new rules. And of course, we can look at whether they did indeed generate 3 new rules, as well as whether each of those rules was naturally different in turn. Another example where we think about shifting perspective is that we present to them that there's a problem with littering, and we ask them to, we provide them with one solution, which is, paying people, or someone's going to pay people to pick up recyclable materials. We then ask them to come up with other perspectives of how we might solve this problem based on who you are in the community. So that's a businessman's perspective, is that he probably has some money he can put behind the solution to this problem. But what might a vet do? What might a photographer do? A gardener, a local historian, or a musician? Might there be different ways of solving this problem depending on the knowledge and expertise that you have? You might see the problem from a different perspective. So looking to identify whether the students can themselves demonstrate an understanding of those different perspectives. And finally, we're looking at 3 different aspects in this assessment item. We provide students a list of 10 objects, and we ask them to trap, capture, or catch an animal, any animal. But we ask them to use 3 or more of the objects and describe how they would actually perform this task. And we're looking to see whether they can manipulate different ideas, put different concepts together, potentially pull apart the problem a little bit, whether what they're describing is actually fit for purpose. Is it actually going to capture or catch an animal? And of course, the novelty with which they apply their thinking around this. Is it something really obvious that they haven't really thought about a new way of thinking around this particular problem? So the third skill, we're thinking about collaboration. We're starting to get a little bit more innovative now with this. And as I mentioned before, developing a collaborative task is a very specific context in which we need to nurture and assess the specific aspects of the skill. I kept talking a little bit earlier about different pieces of the puzzle, and what I was alluding to was this concept of a jigsaw approach, which is prominent in the research for collaboration. And it's that each person is a different piece of the jigsaw, and until you come together as a whole, you're not really going to have the full effect that's needed. So we're emulating that by having different resources and information provided to each of the different students, so that it's not only necessary for them to collaborate, but it's virtually impossible for them to complete the task effectively and well without all of the contributions of everybody in the team. Now, the setup for that initially can be a little bit of work, but what we found is that when you build those tasks, set them up well to begin with, they actually become really great environments for measuring as well as teaching collaboration. And so essentially that initial effort is much more fruitful as we move on. What we're also finding is that centering everything on authentic problem scenarios is very beneficial. It keeps students motivated and it keeps them engaged. And I'll talk a bit more about that specifically in a minute. I've already mentioned the necessity for collaboration, so I'll not go into that in more detail. But we can also focus on multiple tasks that tap into different aspects. So again, we're not expecting there to be one single collaborative task that's going to measure all 12 or all 10 of those aspects that I outlined before. We might have a different task for measuring communication skills, a different task for negotiation, maybe a different task for looking at roles and responsibilities. And through all of this, we're building in reflection opportunities, and I'll come back to that near the end. It's the same thing. This is a prototype that it's actually part of my PhD, but it gave us so much information about collaboration. Now, there's lots to be said about this, so I'll try to keep it relevant. But it's an innovative way of measuring collaboration, but it's not going to give us a measure of every single aspect, much like some of the other examples I was demonstrating don't either. What's happening here is we can see that we've got two screens and two students working together. So student A would see the image on the left-hand screen, and student B would see the image on the right-hand screen. They're definitely on different computers, possibly in different rooms, and in many cases they were in different countries. So the only way for them to communicate is in the text box at the bottom of the screen. It's only text ability. So their communication is limited, and their view of the task is limited. In this particular task, it might be familiar to some of you that know about the Tower of Hanoi problem-solving problem, where you can see it, you can use books to do it in the classroom and so forth. So what we have here is pizza boxes, and they have to stack the pizza boxes onto the cone and then onto the other bike, and they have to do it in a way that allows them to stack them in the appropriate hierarchical order. But of course, if you're A, you can only see the left-hand bike, you can see the pizza boxes in the cone, but student B, when they begin the task, they can only see their own scooter and the cone. They don't even know that there are pizza boxes. They don't get any of this prior knowledge. So one of the first hurdles that students have to overcome is actually identifying that they have different resources, that they don't see the same screen. And of course, pooling those resources together. So try sending me something, and by putting it on the cone, the resource gets sent to the other participant, the other student, and it appears on their screen. So they can manipulate and move the resources back and forth. And of course, in the background, we're capturing every single chat and every single action and the sequence in which those things are occurring. This is another example of a task where now we are delivering packages, and on the left-hand side, student A can see a map of the town, and on the right-hand side, student B controls the scooter and which directions the scooter goes. But the controls for the scooter are abstract, so they've got 4 buttons, but they don't know which one moves forward, back, left, or right. And so part of the task that they've got to overcome here is, first of all, they need to move the scooter to the appropriate location, which is the X on the top left-hand side of the screen, but they also need to work out how the controls work. So again, first of all, because this is the second task, they probably are expecting to see different screens and to have different resources, but you'd be surprised some don't. So that's another first hurdle that they need to overcome. And then, obviously, they have to communicate back and forth about what's happening with the vehicle, which button are you pressing, and so forth. And again, we're capturing everything here. Of course, what we're able to pick up here is the advantage here is that we're able to pick up so much assessment data and the sequence, the nuanced sequences that, say, a teacher observing this type of activity in the classroom would not be able to pick up. However, because it's online, we're not getting any tone of voice, we're not getting any eye contact or body language that obviously could play an important part in collaboration. But we'll use what we are getting from it to bolster our understanding and the validity of the frameworks. We developed a lot of algorithms to basically mine through all of the log files to look for the relevant behaviors in relation to the aspects. So if we recall back to the framework, and we had aspect 3.2, which was resolving differences, we're able to look for that in the chat logs and see if, in fact, students were doing that. So the algorithm might look something along the lines of, first of all, finding, if we think about the controls, and they have to enter which button moves the scooter which direction, and they have to do a drag and drop and match up the directions with the particular buttons, and they have to do this together. Then we might find that the student A initially identifies a different answer than student B. Then we look for particular instances of chat, and then we look for the final rule confirm being changed. So there's a bit of an inference here that what they've been chatting about in between has influenced the other person's decision, so that they ultimately end up negotiating and resolving a difference of agreement. So we can see this sequence happening in microseconds and get all of that information, combine the chat and the actions in order to tell us a little bit more about collaboration that happens in real time and all of the nuance back and forths in that regard. But that's obviously, as I mentioned, the positives and negatives. One way of picking up parts of the framework, one aspect of measuring it, and there's a lot of other ways of measuring it. We have worked with teachers to use behavioral observation worksheets as well. It's very difficult for them to observe specific students' collaboration in groups in a classroom. So what we've started to do is integrate student self and peer evaluation into our collaboration assessments. Now, again, test developers in the room will know self and peer evaluation is notoriously poor in terms of its reliability, but we're not using it to make any important decisions about how a student is performing. Instead, what we're using the peer and self-evaluation for is to involve the students in their own learning in relation to their skills. So transforming our levels of skill development into accessible resources for students so that they know what low versus mid versus high levels of each of those aspects means as well as looks like. And they can use the same terminology, albeit potentially scaffolded down to suit the age group. And we're using the same frame of reference, the frameworks, to have those conversations. So with it, after each of the collaborative tasks that we apply to in the classroom with students, we are asking them to conduct both self-evaluations and peer evaluations and have those conversations. I'll talk a little bit now about how we might bring all of this together. So obviously I've looked at critical thinking items, creative thinking items, collaborative tasks, but we were really keen to look at whether there's a way to try to tap into all of these skills, all of these 6 essential skills in a comprehensive way. And problem-based learning is certainly not the only avenue to measure these skills, but it's certainly seeming to be a very amenable environment or context in which to measure these skills that seems authentic and easy to embed. So what we've got here is the 6 essential skills that we've identified, and this serves as what we've developed as a template assessment that what we're calling is we can plug and play with it. So this context in the middle, this problem-based context, can be anything from very, very specific curriculum topics, so volcano eruption in geography, which is a curriculum topic for many countries, to all the way up to interdisciplinary, and I'll show you an example of our humanities module in a second, to very broad societal issues like climate change. So that problem-based, and we've worked specifically with schools to develop many of these assessments and test out this template approach. But what we essentially have is tasks and rubrics that measure all 6 of the skills in this larger problem-based learning module. Now, it's obviously not intended to be conducted all at once. It would happen over a series of lessons or a series of weeks in the curriculum. But the problem-based learning context allows students to think critically about different information and ideas. So we have our critical thinking. It allows us to think creatively about a problem. So we have our creative thinking. We have students work in groups of 3, so it allows them to work collaboratively to try to find the best solution. And it requires them to regulate their contribution to solving the problem. So we have our self-regulation, that perseverance on the task. It also requires them to communicate their ideas and solutions effectively to others. So we have our communication. And finally, bringing all of this together can be quite a complex and dynamic situation for students. So we're going to require them to control their emotions in these complex situations, hence where we bring in the development of their emotional regulation. So we've got many tasks, many problem scenarios that we've tested this out with, but I thought I'd just share one so I could just demonstrate. So I've sort of gone somewhere in the middle, which is an interdisciplinary one. It's humanities. And this is the problem context is refugee resettlement, and it's something happening globally at the moment. So it's a real authentic problem that potentially students would be able to connect with. So it could be something that's happening at a country level or something that's happening globally. But so what we give the students to begin with is some background information to the problem and to the context. And then we also give them some frequently asked questions and responses from the community about this particular problem. So we can see the task module template here. We've got 8 tasks in total. The tasks are ordered by the problem-solving phase that they go through. And you can see on the far right the different skills that we're measuring in each of these tasks. Now, also I should say as well that not all of these tasks need to be completed. The teachers can select certain ones depending on the skills that they're interested in. So we've got several formats in which this can be divided up. But the 8 tasks are there should they want to. We have some reflective opportunities throughout for the emotional development. So initially, they're presented with the problem, the learning context, and some information behind that. And then the first part is understanding the problem. So looking at the FAQs and looking at some opinion pieces. So if we take the context of refugee resettlement, we've asked some of the community members what they feel about refugees coming to resettle in their community. And so students will individually look at those opinion pieces. Then they go on to individual idea generation around how to solve the problem. Then they come together in a group to identify the best the best solution to the problem together. They agree on dividing up the different roles and responsibilities, work on finalising, and eventually communicate the plan to the rest of their class. So this is one example of a task in this problem-based module that measures critical thinking. So what we're looking at here specifically is their ability to identify assumptions and motivations. So when they're reading the different opinion pieces of the people in the community, they're identifying whether there is any bias in the people's opinions or there's any underlying motivations or assumptions, and we're getting them to discriminate between those different nuanced pieces of information in the text provided. So you can see we have in the purple middle box there our generic criteria, our generic rubric to measure this. And then for this particular humanities task, obviously we would then have a specific coding response. So in this particular piece, this woman in the community called Victoria is concerned that the refugees are coming from parts of the world where they've experienced war, and she says that we all know being exposed to war can be damaging psychologically, and do we really want to risk bringing people with this experience into our community? So we're asking students to identify what is Victoria's real main concern regarding the community based on her opinion provided in the documentation. What's the underlying assumption and motivation? So if students were to say, something that's to do with the reputation of the community, or the response is vague or irrelevant to the STEM, then they obviously get coded 0 for this particular question. So, for example, bringing emotionally damaged people into the community might give our community a bad reputation, or could have a negative impact, or refugees might think they will get hurt. That's irrelevant. They will get a partial mark, so they get scored 1, if they refer to the refugees literally causing, starting, or bringing a war with them. So if they respond that she is maybe actually worried that they're not leaving the war but bringing it with them, or that they might start a war when they come here. And finally, the code 2 refers to the safety of the community, or plausible danger from the refugees. And that's what she's actually implying in this particular opinion piece. So she's scared there might be harm to others, or that there's a danger being brought into the community. So students are able to actually identify opinions and bias and assumptions from others through analysing these critical opinion pieces. So once they've conducted this task, they go on to generate their own ideas for solving the problem. So to give my voice a rest, I thought we might just do another quick task. It can be very quick, but if you have a piece of paper, or if you don't, I've got some here, or on your phone or your laptop, I want you to brainstorm as many ideas as you can in 3 minutes as to how you would solve, what can be done in your local community to support refugees be smoothly reinstated into it. So just jot down the first things that come to your mind to solve this problem. Okay, hopefully you've got some ideas. It's just shy of 3 minutes, I think. But in the interest of finishing reasonably on time, I'll move on to the next slide. What I wanted to show you now is how we were allocating marks to the different aspects in this task when we presented it to students. So I'll now show you some of the ideas that the students came up with, and I'll show you 2 examples, a lower performing student on creative thinking and a higher performing student, and how we determined that. So in this example, you can see student A, who was in the lower performing category. First of all, if we take aspect 1, point 1, we've got number of ideas. They've got 8 text boxes, and they've only provided 4. So it's a fairly straightforward calculation to work out that they're not being very verbose. But they also weren't very strong in their range of ideas. So what we can see here is that all the ideas focus on provision of some sort of resource. So the first idea is about giving money, the second idea is about giving clothes, the next one about giving fruit, and the third one about giving education passes. So it's all just kind of the same category of idea. The next one is that there's very limited perspective that they're thinking about. They're thinking about just the refugees themselves, what the refugees might need to be reinstated into the community. Next, most of the ideas are not really original. So this is a grade 8 student, and a lot of these ideas are very common things to them that we'd experience in their everyday life. So nothing particularly novel happening here. Some of the ideas are quite naive in the sense that they might be fit for purpose in the short term, but not in the long term. Giving them free fruit or giving them $80 is not going to solve their long-term integration into society, into this particular community. And finally, there's a lack of detail. So again, they're giving them money, but it's not really saying what the money is intended to do or why it's that particular amount. So we've got 6 criteria we're measuring here, performing quite low on all of those. In comparison, we can see student B, who already we can identify has got 8 distinct, quite coherent ideas. So they get a larger number of marks for the number of ideas posed. They filled out all the boxes. When we look at the range of ideas, there's a little bit more diversity. So, for example, item 6 that they've identified is to not discriminate children at school on the street. So this is not just about what we can give to the refugees to help them, but it's also what we can do as a society to contribute to this wider problem. The next one is the perspectives. So if you recall in the previous one, it was all about the perspective of the refugees. But here we can see 2, maybe even 3 ideas that actually consider the active role of the community. So having a welcome party to welcome people into the community and have different people meet one another. We're taking different perspectives to look at the problem now. There's also one that, by our terms, was fairly original or fairly novel. So item 7 here, you can see that the community comes together so they can explain, the refugees can explain what they've been through and create a bit of an awareness to what's happening through the world. So we thought this was both good for shifting perspectives, for perspective taking and for novelty for this particular age group. A lot of the ideas, most of them in fact, meet fitness for purpose. We're talking about long-term integration, which is solving that bigger problem. You can see here some housing solutions, short-term to mid-term. And finally, item 7 again demonstrates some elaboration. They've explained why the community is coming together, not just that they will. And so we can see that we're creating a bit of awareness as to what's happening. So usually at this point, and I'm being nice today and we're running out of time anyway, but what I'd do is get you to all swap ideas with the person next to you and mark one another's to see how well you did creatively, but we'll save that. You can take that home as homework. But have a look at these criteria and see how well you did in terms of that. And again, going back to that idea that if you didn't think about what you were being measured on at the start of this task, would that have been much harder to do well in it? So if you didn't know what the aspects were that you're being measured on, for example, if you didn't know that we're looking to see a large number of ideas or a range, or we want you to elaborate on your ideas, if you don't know that those are the criteria, then you're less likely to apply those criteria. So really involving students and teachers in the conversations about understanding the skills and defining them. Just skipping some of this. So what have we found out so far? We have identified differences between grades 6 and 8 and 10 in some of these assessments. We've identified that we can transfer all of the aspects in the frameworks across different learning areas and measure them across those different areas using the same language. And in some cases, we've been able to identify some overlap with the different skills. We can also see the differences in the different aspects within frameworks. So, for example, for critical thinking, applying logic was the most difficult aspect of critical thinking, both in the item examples that I showed you, as well as the problem-based learning situations. In collaboration, communication was quite easy to do, but regulating their own contributions was quite difficult. And then for creative thinking, coming up with multiple ideas was generally really easy, but identifying novel ideas was quite hard. We also ran some factor analysis for the problem-based learning modules to see whether we did an exploratory factor analysis to see whether we were measuring 3 distinct constructs. And what was really interesting was that we actually, in one analysis, ended up with 4 factors. And when we looked inside of the 4th factor, we could see that there was a mix of some of the critical and creative thinking items that measured these 3 aspects. So we conceptually can see that there's some overlap between creative and critical thinking, and then when we test that, we can see that things like identifying patterns and making connections, identifying criteria for making decisions, and elaboration could reasonably come under a mix of creative thinking and critical thinking. There's also, and I think this kind of came up earlier, but and I suppose it's a debate for another day. But we can see some dependency with this particular task. For example, we've done it in a number of ways where we've got younger students who aren't writing, but they're verbalizing the ideas. So we're measuring the same aspects, but at a much lower level, and therefore things like reading comprehension and writing ability is not a confounding factor when we're being able to measure using the same criteria. But we're still seeing some what we call fluency contamination, and this is a huge problem in measuring divergent thinking. It has been since the 1920s. It's been a common feature. So where we're measuring actually just fluency of ideas rather than the sort of quality of ideas. And this is a problem for measuring creative thinking in general. How do we isolate creative thinking from some of the other areas that potentially are confounding factors? I did just also want to mention the early years work that we've done. So after we'd conducted all of this conceptualization, we then went to the lower preschool levels to see what was foundational. And we worked with a lot of early childhood providers to identify the language that really pulls down these skills into that early childhood. So what's foundational? So we can see emotional development, collaboration are there. We also have some physicality considerations. Executive functioning at that lower level essentially then turns into things like self-regulation and critical thinking later on. And observation of comparison is towards the numeracy, and oral language and literacy seems to go across absolutely everything at those foundational levels. But what we did is conceive of learning progressions for each of these 6 skills too. And so we have the learning, we've got for emotional development, we have 3 aspects at the moment: emotion in self, emotional control, and emotion in others. So we're really isolating here the particular parts of socio-emotional learning that we can have an impact on, that's teachable and measurable, and we can look at from a growth perspective and outline different levels of proficiency. We can also do the same with executive functioning. So defining that at the moment as persistence, adaptability, and solving problems. We don't think we've got this one quite right yet, but this one's a work in progress. It's very difficult to conceive of what executive functioning looks like beyond specific contexts. And so this is, but we know it's there. We know how important it is. So we're keen to do a little bit more work on this one. What we've been doing in the early childhood sector is actually having educators use the learning progressions as the measurement tool. So basically using these progressions in particular contexts to observe particular behaviours, and then identifying where their students or their children are at on those levels. Again, we've got different contexts in which to observe them, but these are some of the distributions that we're seeing in terms of which levels that the children are presenting on. And in a lot of cases, we can see potentially an anticipated bell curve, but you can see there's something funny happening with executive function. We only have 3 levels identified, and it seems to decline a little bit. We're not seeing it much at the high level. And as well, with oral language and literacy, we were not seeing any of the highest 2 levels being presented. So we're only seeing the lower levels. So perhaps we've pitched that one too high. We're getting into more school level descriptions of oral language. What have I got? Three minutes? Stop? Yes. All good? That was absolutely fantastic. No worries. A few minutes for questions.
Well, thank you, Claire. It was very content-rich presentation. I still have to order my thoughts on some of the aspects. In fact, my main question is about the instrument itself. I'm not entirely sure I understood what is the instrument, because you at some point you were mentioning a number of items which was high. So I didn't understand, is that number of items like specific for each construct, which would create something enormous, but sometimes the number of items can also be very easy. So
yeah, sure. I suppose we've got a number of different measures or assessments that I've sort of pulled together here for the presentation, but that one I was talking about, 61 items, was the number of items we've generated to measure critical thinking in total. Some of those are context specific or domain specific. Some of them are domain general. And then some of those we've packaged together into assessments for those 3 different age groups. So all up, those assessments, so the pool of items, this is like 61 or whatever the number was, and then we pool some of those together for grade 6, for grade 8 and grade 10. And so they take an assessment that's approximately an hour long, just to give us an indication of where their critical thinking, creative thinking is at the moment.
So the 1 hour long assessment covers these 3 constructs?
No, so we've got both critical thinking, creative thinking separately. And so an hour for each of those. And then the collaborative assessments, again, took an hour, and there was 3 specific tasks that they undertook within that 1 hour.
Okay. And to provide some context, what's the driver of this work? Is it to eventually develop a new tool to be offered? Is it because, I don't know, the Australian government came to you and said, look, we made all these changes to the curriculum. We'd like you to help us measure them, because it's different if you're working for someone that probably has some constraints, some frameworks, some limitations, or if it's a free will undertaking.
I think that's a really good question, because that's what we've been privileged enough to be able to do, is not be driven by what we're trying to do is come up with something conceptually that can work for a lot of different education systems. That there's a consistent approach that we can take, and so what we're really looking at is how we can best assess these aspects in these skills, what types of items really get at the essence of the skills and what we're able to do, but also what we're missing. So, where is that point between, I showed some quite basic items and then quite innovative items. And what we suspect is that there's a sweet spot in the middle that we're kind of aiming for. And so what we're able to do at the moment is sort of experiment around with that. We've not got high stakes a situation at the moment where we're delivering this for a country where we're trying to help find is that sweet spot where we're optimally measuring the skills without it being too much of an addition and a burden, but also gives us a reasonable amount of information. So internally that's what we're working out, but also at the same time we've got a number of countries we're working with to actually develop specific assessment items that do more fit within their own agendas. So some of those items were examples or variations of those examples where we take existing items and we adapt them, but we to further emphasize or focus on the skills. And to us, though, that's an interim solution. That's a solution that puts less burden on the system, obviously less personnel resources, financial resources. It's a suitable solution in the meantime until we can all sort of agree on the ideal approach and how we can measure these skills.
That would include the 6 core constructs that in a single tool, because that's looking a lot like a 6-hour assessment. Some teachers may be a little reticent.
Well, that's right. I think we need to think about the purpose. It might not be that we measure every skill in the eventual assessment. Certainly, as I say, with those problem-based learning assessments that are more classroom-orientated, those go over a number of weeks. So you're capturing that data, or at least a number of lessons. You're capturing that data constantly. It's infused and integrated into what you're doing in the classroom. So I wouldn't want students to sit down and have to take a really, really long test just to measure 6 different skills. But it could be that we're integrating questions to measure different aspects in regards to different skills in some of their existing national assessments as well.
Are teachers getting information from you that they can use in the classroom?
Well, I think that's it. I mean, it's really good to think about the big picture and getting a lay of the land in terms of where the students are at, but students aren't going to progress unless teachers understand what these skills are and they have resources. That's what they're crying out for, is resources to teach it. So that's really actually what these frameworks were initially intended for, was teachers. But we found, as I mentioned, application with them at a national level as well. So education systems now auditing curriculum, developing assessments for their national assessment tests, using the aspects in these frameworks. So we've discovered a wider application for these conceptualizations than we'd intended. But that's good, because that means in the countries we're working, teachers and the education systems are using the same language.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
That's a real breakthrough. But as you say, teachers need help understanding the conceptualization and then developing the practice, which can lead to these being useful tools. I mean, I was thinking particularly about the critical thinking, because the paradigm of most teachers is, I know what you need to know, and I have sifted it, and everything I will tell you is true and important, and therefore just listen. And critical thinking is completely suspended in all classrooms.
That's right. And this goes back to a wider problem too about curriculum being already overcrowded. And so what a lot of teachers, what a lot of schools and teachers have been grappling with, that we've been working with, is, they don't have the time at the moment to stop and think about the skills and teach them. So, for example, a lot of the pedagogical strategies around critical thinking is asking students why they are providing a particular answer, or asking them to justify their responses to questions. And that takes a bit of time in the flow of the classroom. You know, that requires you to stop as a teacher, to hand over the classroom to the student, in a sense, and space for that response to occur and that thinking to happen. And if you're just talking at the students constantly, there's not that exchange, there's not that learning. So
Absolutely. But
teachers need the confidence to do that, and the knowledge that that's what's important.
I was watching a teacher in a school in Pakistan in one of our programs, and she was teaching natural sciences to 12-year-olds. But she developed this technique in agreement with the children, that she'd explain a topic, right? But one bit of it would be a lie, and they had to work out what it was. And she had the most astonishing levels of concentration from her students I'd ever seen, because they all wanted to work out the lie. But to do that, they had to process the information. Remembering the information is no use to them at all. They've got to go, could that be a lie? No, I don't think so. Could that be a lie? So they were really thinking hard, because they wanted to be the person who went to do that. So I think these are actually much easier to achieve in classrooms than people think, if you're creative with your teaching practice.
That's right. What you just described there is essentially discriminating between
Yes, it is.
pieces of
Absolutely.
information.
Absolutely.
And so what we've actually found is that a lot of teachers say, oh, I think I've been doing a lot of this already. I just didn't connect it to what everyone's talking about in terms of skills
Absolutely.
or capabilities or competencies. It was just something that happens
Yes.
in my classroom. So we need to mine for some of these examples a bit,
Yeah, absolutely.
that's practical.
Yeah.
And it's not about adding to what teachers do, it's about transforming what they do. And it's also about finding the opportunities that are really amenable to teach the skills and integrate the skills, and providing more space for that to happen. And that's our entry point in, I think.
Absolutely. More questions? Let me find a microphone.
Thank you for your presentation. Yeah. So I'm just like wonder about the creativity, the framework that you just like introduced to me, because like I also try to evaluate my student in many aspects of creativity. So I just wondering that the way that you evaluate or assess the creativity, is that there's some kind of like summative assessment?
Not specifically summative. What you can do with the framework is essentially turn it into any form of assessment, really. So you've got basically you can see the aspects as the criteria, and then you can view the levels of development as the quality of those, the level of quality of that criteria. So you can develop assessments that are summative or are formative, or are, you know, more broad or narrow. So we've seen examples and tried out different examples of applying these in all types of assessment. Where we're seeing the real value, though, is in using the descriptions in the learning progressions to feed back to teachers and students and parents as well. In terms of, particularly in the early childhood, we experimented a lot with reporting back to parents what the children were doing in the progressions that allowed us to identify what level of collaboration or emotional development or executive functioning the children were at. And so using that same language to feed it back, because what's in the learning development levels is observable behaviors. So it's things that are tangible that we can see. And so instantly we're able to connect what we're observing in the classroom with the skill. And then of course, that makes sense for when we're communicating that level. You know, it's sort of almost irrefutable. You say to the parent, I saw this student do this over and over again, therefore we identify them at this level. And then, as I say, you can identify how they need to progress by looking at what they need to do at the next level. And so that's our best value add, I think, by having those nuanced differences in proficiency, that we're able to to do that. But yeah, I think it's really admirable that you're trying to create almost your own framework, and this is very common, and it was a concern for us in the sense that we were talking with lots of different teachers and schools globally, and they said, we're trying to come up with a framework too. And look, quite frankly, we could have a whole week's debate about how many strands and how many aspects there are, and if you could move this one into this strand and so forth. And we've done all that ourselves. We just got to a point where we thought, this is justifiable, we can use this. And so the point is not more about is it perfect, but is it usable, can it be applied in order to progress the skills and focus on the little bits of the skills so that you yourself don't have to create the wheel, reinvent the wheel every single time. And this school has this framework and the next school over has this framework, and they're talking about the same thing, just in a slightly different way. So that's what we're trying to help with a little bit.
Absolutely. But on more than one occasion now, you described this experience of starting off with some fairly simple criteria and then meeting with teachers and them going, but we want more definition, and the adding in of those definitions through consultation. And then eventually you put it all together. And then you go back to the same teachers and say, here you are. And they went, impossible. I want nothing to do with it. What seems to me to be the case is that the teachers who are willing to engage and go, no, I want more definition, are going through a process of beginning to take ownership of the thinking and so forth. But when you end up with the detail, it's then overwhelming to them. And therefore, somehow, you need to steer the conversation through that, because that's so much part of their learning process about, but what you really mean is this, and you've forgotten this category, and so on and so forth. And then get to the end and go, okay, let's scrap all that and get back to the basics once again, because otherwise you're left with a huge problem. And TDRI, who spoke yesterday about their research, was exactly that process. They'd done an amazing international review. They'd collected lots. They sat with teachers. Teachers said, yes, what about that? What about that? What about that? And they ended up with 185 level indicators. Yeah. And the whole thing collapsed. Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's it. And I suppose coming full circle to my original point too was that, just looking at 3 skills over the last 2 hours, we see how incredibly complex each of those is in and of its own right. And so if we go back to my second or third slide and think about all those skills that we're trying to attain and achieve for everyone, and again, I'm not refuting that any of those aren't important, but it might be the case that we need to focus on a set of them that are the highest impact, potentially, of most influence on other skills. So if we can develop good critical thinkers, people who can think creatively, people who can self-regulate and control their emotions appropriately, then we are going to end up with quite holistically developed, resilient learners that can manage over a different number of situations.
And I think listening over the last 2 days, so forth, with my EEF ears on, is that it's definitely that, I've got the big picture. Now how do we make it a small picture is the next stage in development to get that right. I think we must end there. We've run over time. Another really fascinating day, and thank you to all the contributors for really stretching my brain. I don't know about everybody else's. I've learnt so much. We have another day tomorrow, so we'll see you all again in the morning. Thank you very much indeed.